One of the first things players are going to notice when they start playing this mod is just how slow everything is. In fact, it looks as though everything's moving in slow motion. There's a very good reason for this, and anyone who's been involved in tabletop wargaming, or in particular designing rules for tabletop wargaming, will understand the conflicts that occur between figure scale, ground scale, vertical scale and time scale. In this particular instance, Kaunitz has been struggling with the issue of figure scale, which has a direct influence on ground scale. And this is the best compromise he's managed to come up with so far. And I'll just take a break here because I'll explain what the problem is for those who don't understand it. Here we see a Prussian battalion from the battle deployed in 3 deep line. It consists of just over 200 figures, but in reality it represents a force which would have contained somewhere in the region of 600 men. And we know from historical documents how much space 600 men formed in a 3 deep line actually took up when they were deployed on the battlefield. This distance, known as the unit frontage, would have been somewhere in the region of 122 yards. So therefore, the frontage that the unit occupies in the game is the equivalent of 122 yards in real life, and that in effect dictates the ground scale. We also know from historical documents how fast a unit in line would move over the ground. So in the case of a Prussian battalion, we know that it would advance at a standard rate of 156 feet per minute. So that tells us that the battalion in the picture there ought to be moving at a rate which takes it 2 minutes 20 seconds to cover the distance of its own frontage, which gives us the movement rate for the game. Now instead, what we find in the vanilla game and in most mods is that the designers have chosen a movement rate which looks correct given the height of the figures. The problem with this is that if you superimpose another scale underneath the ground scale, which divides the frontage up into 6-foot units, and then turn that vertically against the height of the figures, you'll see that a 6-foot tall human at the right scale for the ground scale would only be, well, they would be under half the height of the figures in the game. So if you're going to move those figures at a speed that looks right given their height, then they're going to be moving at least twice the speed they should be moving, and probably 3 times the speed. And that immediately creates a conflict, because if the units in the game are moving at 3 times the speed they should be moving, that means that time must be passing at 3 times the speed of real time. And that creates conflicts with other aspects of the game. For example, it's normally accepted that an infantryman from this period could manage to fire approximately 3 rounds per minute from their musket. We also know that the maximum range of a musket was around 300 yards. So if the battalion in our picture here was advancing on an enemy battalion, and that enemy opened fire as soon as it came within 300 yards, then we know that it would take approximately 5 minutes for our battalion to come into contact with the battalion it was attacking. During that time, it could expect to receive anything up to 15 volleys of musketry from the defending battalion. If you compare that with what actually happens in Empire Total War at the moment and what happens in most mods, you realise just how much of a compromise the game designers have made. One possible compromise that Kaunitz has considered is accelerating real time. This would justify the units moving at a faster speed, which looks correct for the figures, but would adjust the rate of fire so that defending units would get as many shots at the approaching enemy as they should do historically. That might result in units firing anything up to 10 rounds per minute instead of 3. The one option that modders and designers don't have with a real-time game is the one that's actually used in tabletop wargaming, which is to fudge the timescale. If you look at most tabletop wargaming rules, you'll find that the movement is based upon a timescale of perhaps 15 minutes per turn or 10 minutes per turn, but the actions that occur within the turn are considered to only represent what happens in around 30 seconds to a minute. Unfortunately, that's only possible because tabletop war games are turn-based games, and as Empire Total War is a real-time game, that option isn't available. Time passes at the rate that time passes, and both the actions and the movement and the weapons ranges all have to be synchronized. So hopefully that explains this slow-mo effect that we're looking at here. These battalions are advancing at an approximately accurate rate, but because of the height of the figures, it just makes it look like they're walking really slowly. Now, the other thing I noticed right at the start of this test battle, and other people have mentioned it too, is that if you look at these units, and I'll go to the end of the column because it's more obvious there. If we look at this unit here, it's very tired already. If you go back to the front of the column, and look at the leading unit, that's very tired as well. I found that a bit confusing at first because there was no reason for them to be tired. They're only walking in formation. But I think the best way to explain this in terms of sort of reality is that fatigue in this mod doesn't really represent tiredness. It represents disorganisation or lack of unit cohesion within the unit. So when a unit's changing formation or trying to keep alignment with another unit, it's constantly battling against a loss of unit cohesion. And these units have only recently formed a column, so the officers and NCOs in them are actually pushing them back into line. As you can see, as we're looking at it, they're gradually getting fresh. So that would indicate that the officers and NCOs are actually getting them under control. They're redressing the ranks, making sure they're all the stragglers are in position. And you'll find this throughout the mod, that as you're playing it, if you rush units around or ask them to change formation, they rapidly become tired. And the tiredness actually affects not only their morale, but also the efficiency of their firing, which is what you'd expect if the unit was getting into a confused state. There you see, this regiment's now fresh. So I've sort of suggested that we stop thinking when we're playing this mod. We stop thinking about fatigue and try to think in terms of unit cohesion, and I found it makes a lot more sense if you think of it in those terms. Well, as you can see, the two Prussian columns are proceeding on their way. The column on the left is just heading into the mouth of the D-file now, and the column on the right is heading nicely towards the valley on the right. Everything's going according to the plan at the moment. One of the advantages of this slower speed, and consequently the smaller ground scale, is that I'm already getting the feeling that the battlefield is much bigger than it normally is. That there seems to be room to do this sort of major manoeuvring. So there is some advantage to it. Obviously there's nothing much happening at the moment apart from my army moving into action. So, I mean, I think the solution here is probably, if it's too boring just watching your men marching across the battlefield, is just to increase the speed. So I'll put it on double speed for a little while and let things run on a bit.